Hey guys, this is your Halfwit here with another juicy topic. As always, thank you to Steven Erickson for sharing and almost commenting on my last video. So, the subject of our analysis today, guys, is none other than the embodiment of Malazan dichotomies, the magus of House Shadow himself, Iskaral Pust. Is he a brilliant guy who just happens to adopt a buffoonish persona? Or is he an actual buffoon who stumbles his way into occasional brilliance? These are the hard hitting questions for which we seek answers in today's video. I called him the embodiment of dichotomy in the series for a reason, because in many ways that's what he is, where you don't quite know which side of the fence he's on in all kinds of ways. And as the title suggests, one of the fundamental questions is whether the guy is a genius or an idiot. And as we all know, the accurate but boring answer to that question would be both, because clearly he's both a brilliant mage and a complete buffoon. But that's an easy and predictable answer, and it doesn't really capture the complexity of the man or the role he plays in the 10 big books. So, in today's discussion, we delve into who Iskaral Pust is, what he's capable of, the role he plays in the overall plot, and the role he plays in the overall themes of the Malazan series. And don't worry, I will be picking a side at the end of this analysis. I'm not going to give you a pop out easy answer like, oh, he's both, right? I will be choosing a side between genius and idiot. So, who is he? As you all know, he's the high priest and magi of House Shadow, which makes him the second highest authority in that entire house, or the third highest if you count Cotillion, right? Either way, it's a pretty big deal. He is Dalhonis by origin, and we get a few tidbits of his childhood here and there. We hear that he used to be quite a naughty kid. I mean, obviously, it's Iskaral Pust, right? But for the most part, he remains a creature of complete mystery to us as the readers. We get almost nothing about who he really is. Even his sanity is a complete mystery, especially in terms of whether it even exists, right? So, as far as the plot goes, his role is usually on the macro level. Since he's Shadow Throne's primary tool, it's the big picture schemes that he's involved in. In Deadhouse Gates, it's to lead all the soul taken away from the real destination into the Azath house. He has other objectives in Deadhouse Gates, like sending Apsala on her way, trying to convince her to become Shaik, bringing Icarium to the Azath house and all that. But the diversion of the Path of Hands was more or less his main task in Deadhouse Gates. In House of Chains, his job was to keep Kalam alive. In the Bone Hunters, his job was to save Mapo and get on that ship with him. And in Troll the Hounds, his job was to steal Dragnipur. And he was successful, if you think about it, in all these schemes except the final one. Despite all his shenanigans, this guy, for whatever reason, always gets the job done, except in cases where even Shadow Throne is kind of eclipsed by the convergence of powers going on, right? Because the only time Iskaral Pust was thwarted, as I said, was at the end of Toll the Hounds. And let's look at all the obstacles that were in his way. Obviously, Krupp, but beyond that, there was Hood, Darsim, Anamanda Rake, Kasa, the Segule Second, Ula Shon, Envy, Spite, Kaladin Brood, Baruch, all the Hounds of Shadow that were alive at that point, all the Hounds of Light, blah blah blah. And this isn't even counting people like Kalor or Kolat or Spinok Durev, who were all still around there somewhere in the periphery of Darujistan, who would have gotten involved had Iskaral Pust tried to actually acquire Dragnipur, right? So the only time he failed in his mission was when the convergence itself was on a scale much bigger than even what Shadow Throne can handle. The only other venture in which you could say he somewhat failed was in convincing Absalom to become Shaikh, but that situation was a lot more complicated there because his own masters, especially Cotillion, mind you, were already having second thoughts about how Absalom should be used and about whether Absalom should even be used at all for this. So that entire sorry thing was not really a failure of Pust's plans. All of this obviously adds to the argument that the guy's brilliant because one can surely make the case that intelligence should be judged by results and not by words. You can have people who say and do the dumbest shit, but their sheer competence can sometimes make you question that assumption. Let's look at some of the things about Pust that make him look brilliant and competent so that we can judge this a little more. Number one, he's arguably the most knowledgeable healer in the entire series. Even Mapo, who's shown being very knowledgeable about herbs and healing himself, says he's never seen medical procedures done the way Iskaral Pust does them. In fact, the number of people Pust has saved from sure death with his medical skills is kind of crazy. He saves Fiddler by rebuilding his entire crushed foot and fixing his punctured lung. He saves Kalam from sure death by fixing his wounds after that Enkaral demon type thing attacks him, despite the cuts being really deep. And he saves Mapo twice. Once in book 2, where he saves the Trell from this fever that drives people mad once they've been attacked by a soul taken or divers. And more importantly, he saves Mapo later on in the Bone Hunters, after Mapo's been attacked by Dejim Nebral and all that. And Iskaral Pust carries him out of that crevice and treats his wounds. So that's a testament to his medical skills. They far surpass the skills of anyone else we've seen in the books, is what I would argue. Number two, Iskaral Pust is extremely knowledgeable. He seems to be aware of many things. For one, he knew about the chain of dogs even before most of the others were even aware that it had begun. Not only can he read the deck of dragons, but he seems to get information out of it in a way that even other adepts like Fiddler can't. His deception skills are good enough to trick the most powerful soul taken into following the false path of Hans. Even Icarium is shocked by the tomes in Pust's library collection. He's like, I can't believe this lunatic has all this crazy shit. His arcane perception is so off the chart that he knows that the Erasal is with them and that Spite is trying to convince her not to leave when they're traveling on that ship in the Bone Hunters. And finally, number three, Pust is one of the most sophisticated mages we've seen in the series. On top of the stuff that I mentioned earlier, his mastery of magic is good enough to do things like communicating directly with Shadow Throne to instantly summon the Hounds of Shadow. He can teleport and blast you with magic like what he did with Dejim Nebral, which is an awesome scene, right? Because Dejim Nebral is shown as being strong enough to wipe out the Nameless Ones. And even by the time we're in book 6, we don't really think Pust can fight at this point, because throughout the whole Path of Hands storyline in Deadhouse Gates, where all those guys have to fight their way through the Azat against all these soul taken, Iskaral Pust does no fighting in that sequence at all. So to see him in the Bone Hunters teleporting around and blasting the 5 different forms of Dejim Nebral until it decides to run away, that was a really cool scene. So we can see from all these things, from his knowledge, his mastery of magic and all that, we see that in terms of his feats, the guy is extremely strong, extremely competent, and almost always successful in whatever he sets out to do. So in that case, why the debate, right? It should be clear that the guy is brilliant, that he's a genius. Well, the answer, as we all know, isn't that simple because of one of the great tropes of Ericksonian humor. Most long-time subscribers would know that I've used this term often called Ericksonian humor, especially when I've discussed characters like Pehol or Baukelane or the Bridge Burners. The basic concept is that the use of humor in the 10 big books spans a number of different comedic genres, from slapstick comedy to witty dialogue to toilet humor to the use of irony to puns and innuendo, blah blah blah. And all of this is presented in a very unique Ericksonian way in that mythology of the Malazan universe. And here we see an actual example of what I mean by this, by Ericksonian humor. This trope is where Erickson loves using the shadow warren to keep us guessing about the sanity and intelligence of a certain character. And it makes sense given that shadow has this blurry, intangible quality to it, and that it's the warren of illusion and deceit and things like that. So we see this dichotomy with Shadow Throne, we see it with Iskaral Pust. We even see it with the Stillwater in Erickson's latest book, all of whom are deeply connected with the Shadow Warren. With all these characters, the question of whether they are brilliant or insane is deliberately used by Erickson to make us laugh. You could even add Telorust and Curdle to that list, whom we know were imprisoned in the Shadow Warren for a long, long time. And we keep asking ourselves if all these people have some method behind the madness, because they all seem really smart and really dumb at the same time. Iskaral Pus clearly comes across as a stereotype of this and comes across as an idiot because of his tendency to speak out loud when he shouldn't, right? So he's the type of guy to be like, oh, please follow me. And then be like, oh, haha, this fool follows me without realizing that it's a trap or whatever, right? And he would say it out loud, loud enough for you to hear it, sometimes even when he's still looking at you. And he obviously does this to everybody he encounters in the 10 big books. And why this makes him look even dumber than it would with other characters is because all his objectives involve scheming and deception in some kind of way. And thinking out loud in clear contradiction to what you just said, especially when you're still looking at the person you said it to, is not exactly how you deceive people, right? It must be said, though, that everything around him accentuates this theme of dichotomy and confusion. And exploring this is when we actually realize what a careful and intricately created character Iskaral Pust actually is. Because even though he's essentially little more than comic relief, that's what he is. The theme of dichotomy and flux is so deliberately imbued by Erickson in everything around the character. So, if you take his mule, for instance, there's the dichotomy of whether it really is some kind of super magic beast or whether it's just a dumb mule, as he claims. On some occasions, we see even the hounds of light not wanting to have anything to do with that mule. And on others, we see it acting like a typical dumbass. Not dumbass, dumb ass, right? We see a contrast even in the way Pust rides the mule, if you think about it, because he always rides it like he's galloping it, and the rails are flailing about, and he acts like he's holding on for dear life against the wind and all that. But in reality, the mule's taking one step forward every 1 minute or 2 minutes or something like that, right? So the mule is moving in slow motion while he's all frantic, and this is how he usually travels. We see this juxtaposition again with his wife Mogora, where she by herself, much like the mule, is a thing of mystery, where it's not quite clear if she's more in touch with her human side or her spider side because she's a diverse. Pust himself seems to think of her as a spider sometimes and as a human sometimes. And there's the added juxtaposition of everyone else thinking that these two are perfect for each other and that they're a perfect couple, even as they squabble all the time. And on top of all this, Iskaral Pust is also almost always involved in storylines that deal with duality and dichotomy in some way. The contradiction between Icarium being such a gentle guy and a historical killing machine is a big part of Deadhouse Gates, for example. And Pust is a prominent part of that journey. He's one of the sparks that create the fight between Lady Envy and Sister Spite in Book 8, because he's the one who tells Envy that Spite is in Darujistan. So there's once again this duality that he's involved in. He's in charge in Book 2, as I said, of diverting the soul taken and divers, who are themselves dichotomous beings, right? Trapped between a bestial side and a human side. And here, of course, we can briefly mention the Bokrala as well, those little creatures which follow Pust around and worship him. The way he's worshipped by the Bokrala, or whatever their name is, it's very amusing social commentary on how religion is practiced in our own world, especially with the way the followers don't really give a shit about what the god wants and how they make it all about what they want instead. So even though he hates it, they constantly mimic him. They provide him with sacred offerings like shit and piss and all that. In fact, they even shit under his pillow in his bed as an offering. And all this also fits in with the way that the gods often resent their own worshippers and the offerings of their worshippers, even in the Malazan world. So, if you remember that scene where Bug complains about Mayan temples always being noisy and dirty, that's essentially the same complaint that Iskaral Pust has about his own devotees, the Bokharal. And this also mirrors his own relationship with Shadow Throne. So, just as how he annoys his god, Shadow Throne, he annoys the hell out of Shadow Throne, by the way, he in turn gets annoyed by his worshippers. So, there's this mirror thing going on once again. And it also fits with the way in which these chosen mortals sometimes mirror the gods in the 10 big books. So, as you know, many Malazan gods have favored mortals whom they have some kind of affinity towards, even if they are not an official part of their house. So, Bug has Tihol, Kurul has Krupp, and Shadow Throne, even though Pust is much more an official part of House Shadow, Iskaral Pust is kind of Shadow Throne's version of that, right? And all these chosen mortals reflect that god in some way, and they also have an external facade in some way. So, with all this now having been laid out, let's revisit the fundamental question at hand. Is he a genius or is he an idiot? I know that from everything I've said so far about his accomplishments and strategic success and all that, I know that the sensible thing to say would be that he's a genius. But fuck it. It is Iskaral Pust after all. I mean, guys, come on. We know that this guy has shit for brains, right? This fool saves Mapo, but then was about to accidentally rub Peralt on the wounds, which his wife arrives and stops, right? And that would have killed Mapo instantly. Peralt, by the way, is the same poison that Pearl uses on Kalam when he shoots him. So you know how strong that thing is. The guy gets into a staring contest with the Bokrala for like 4 hours. And not only does he lose the contest after trying to hang on for 4 hours, he then convinces himself that it was a sign of his own superiority that he got distracted elsewhere. He gets swatted aside by the Hounds of Shadow when they see him, and he kind of convinces himself that they were just overexcited to see him. He regularly gets tricked by these mini monkeys which worship him, which by itself says a lot about his intellectual caliber, right? The guy, the guy sometimes forgets basic things like how to uncross your legs, and he ends up falling off the damn mule because of that. Yes, it's true that he laid out a brilliant plan to lure all the soul taken and divers away and put them into this Azath house or whatever. But the nemesis that he hates the most, those fucking spiders that he keeps trying to kill, he doesn't realize that that was a diverse that had outsmarted him all along. So that the guy, these are all the things that prove, rather, that the guy is more or less a dumbass. And this time I do mean the word dumbass in that sense. He frequently has mosquitoes and insects stuck in his teeth when he grins. I mean, come on, he's gross, he's dumb, he's all of those things. There are two small moments where he kind of breaks character and almost reveals that the entire thing is an act, that the entire thing is a gimmick. There's this great scene in Deadhouse Gates where they all talk about what a fool he is, and he suddenly says, "So they judge me ineffectual," in this completely different voice. And they all look at him and he just smiles at them and says nothing more. And there's another scene at the end of Deadhouse Gates again, where he and Mogora are squabbling as usual. But he has this line to himself where he goes, "Ah, glad to see I've not lost my charm," when he sees Mogora flying into a rage, right? And it implies that he actually likes these squabbles and that he knows exactly what he's doing. But other than these two moments and all the other moments of competence that I mentioned earlier, the guy's a complete moron, guys. Come on. Of course, this isn't a bad thing in this context because that stupidity is what allows him to be such a force to be reckoned with, right? If he was simply a normal, powerful mage like Teshren, for example, would he have been able to do everything that he did? Could he have accompanied all those people on all those journeys had he not been a buffoon? Because you're dealing with ancient beings like Icarium, Mapo, Envy, Spite, and you're then dealing with very perceptive bridge burners like Fiddler, Kalam, Apsala, etc. So Iskaral Pust often accompanies and sets these people on a journey. And if it really was an act, if he really was a genius who was pretending to be an idiot, one of these people would have been perceptive enough to have caught on to it. But instead, all they see is a genuinely annoying clown. Icarium almost strangles him to death at one point. Crocus almost stabs him to death at one point. Most of the people he deals with realize that it's the solitude of living in that shadow temple by himself and the whispering of Shadow Throne, which probably drove him mad. And that makes sense, right? Because even though Shadow Throne himself acknowledges that it doesn't quite control Puss completely, it is quite believable that it was Shadow Throne's influence that made Puss so much like him. And Shadow Throne too knows that this guy is completely insane now, but that's what he seems to want. Because the one thing we know about Shadow Throne, think about this. The one thing we know about Shadow Throne is that he does far better than the other gods when it comes to improvising. In fact, you could argue that Shadow Throne ultimately won the war between the gods in the 10 big books precisely because he improvised better than the rest of the gods. So having this completely unpredictable idiot as his tool, as his pawn, works out great for Shadow Throne because he knows that he can adapt to any unexpected turn of events that this clown might cause. And the feeling is completely mutual, by the way, since Pust is also almost always, referring to Shadow Throne as being idiotic or insane, right? So calling Pust a blithering half-wit isn't really an insult in the same way that it would be an outright insult to call most other people that. With him, it's far more of a description of his modus operandi. His job is not just to pretend to be an idiot, his job is to be an actual idiot. Because that's precisely what Shadow Throne needs for his schemes. And with all the armpit jokes and fart jokes and shit jokes and piss jokes and vomit jokes that we get through the character of Iskaral Pust whenever he's on the page, it's quite clear that he succeeds on that front, right? As he himself very arrogantly claims in House of Chains, there is none better at misdirection than Iskaral Pust. This is what he says about himself. And the fact that he's saying this right in the midst of completely failing to misdirect Kalam tells you what you need to know about the guy. I'll end this video by discussing the very last scene of Iskaral Pust in the 10 Big Books because it's quite an amusing note to end on. So his last scene is where we see him rewriting parts of the Book of Shadows, which is like the holy book of House Shadow, right? And this is so fitting as his final scene because there's this new priestess of Shadow he meets in Darujistan, and the idiot is in love with her and wants to make her his second wife. And when Shadowthrone and Cotillion discuss this, Cotillion asks Shadowthrone, he's like, so are high priests of House Shadow allowed to have two wives? What did you put in the Book of Shadows? Because that's the book of laws that they need to follow. And Shadowthrone's like, you know what, I don't really know what's in that book. And Cotillion goes, well, if you don't know what it is, did you even write it? And he realizes from Shadowthrone's silence, much to his own horror, that it was actually Iskaral Pust whom Shadowthrone had delegated that task to, and we all now know why these Shadow Warren people are so messed up. It's because their Bible, their Quran, was written by this lunatic. And in his final scene, we see him drying up some ink as he edits these pages, because he's obviously rewriting the holy book to assert that the magus of House Shadow can indeed have two wives. And how appropriate it is that even in his last scene, Erikson manages to use this theme of duality with the two wives concept to make us all laugh. So that was my analysis of Iskaral Pust, guys. The guy is a complete dolt, trust me, there's no doubt about it. But it's the fact that he's a dolt which makes him so formidable to his enemies and which makes him so useful to Shadowthrone. This is your High Fist. Take care, and I'll see you soon.